And now we'll go right into the end of year 4 submission. Okay, so let's look at these record relationships. So it's a little bit tricky. So we'll start over here in blue because it's simplest. Your post-secondary status are for outcomes for students who have left the previous academic year. So all your students need really are 23-24 enrollment, and you could submit your post-secondary status file. The post-secondary status is unrelated to the special education file submitted this year because these are records from students from last year. Now over here, it's tricky because the only thing that is strictly required, right, is ownership. That comes from the SENR file. Now, to submit a plan, you need a status and a meet file. Ultimately, they can be submitted in any order, the status or meet, but to submit a plan, you need both of these. To submit a meet file, you would need a status as well, right? And why would a student have a meet and not a plan? Well, what if the student's not eligible or doesn't receive services, right? So, students are tested and evaluated. That's going to come from the meet. And if they don't go on an active plan as a result, that's what they're going to have, a meet and a status. And the status might be a non-participation status, right? So the order of submission isn't as important as, making sure that these files are required come. And then if you have a plan, you always have to report the corresponding services, right? So even if the plan is amended, you have to make sure that the service record is updated to match the amendment. All right, so here we have the student profile data, right? And we have the relevant files for students with disabilities. And then once a student has a status, you would only submit a status when it changes. Most students are going to have eligible and participating status. They're going to go to another district, adopt a plan, eventually have a new IEP or new IFSP, what have you, a new plan. Status doesn't change. They're eligible and participating. Until they are no longer eligible or no longer participating, the status need not change. A student can transfer into your district, go for a few years and leave, and you've never submitted a status record. That's perfectly normal. The special education meet must correspond with the plan type. So it can get tricky if you have a student who's gone out of state and they come back with the IEP, but their last meeting reported was an IFSP, right? You have to have record of a evaluation for their current plan. A lot of times you didn't give the evaluation or the initial evaluation, but that record has to be there for their plan. So students that transition from one plan to another can get out of sync in their records. So that's why we have this note, the meet record must correspond with the plan type. Now the plans, are the records that are updated most, and those students on active plans, whether they're IEPs, IFSPs, or ISPs, you see the most transactions for plan type. And so those active plans are submitted and they must have a corresponding service record. So you'll see several of the same services reported as in this screenshot here, because every time the plan is updated, which it's mandatory to be updated once a year, right? At least once a year, you have to have a plan review. You could have those services unchanged, but be reported again. And so here's a student in test. Of course, it's a tennis shoe, not a real student, right? And in CALPADS, we're used to seeing the student enrollment. Your special education containers are down here at the bottom. These are historical. That's why they're read-only. Pretty much they're meaningless now. But you have your status, your meeting, your plans, and services. And we see the potential error here. This student has no services, but has a plan. You would open the container, right? And you would look at the modal and make corrections to the data. So we'll be doing that shortly. So let's talk about the status. So the status helps identify students who have been evaluated for special education services and the results of those evaluations, right? The status goes a long way to provide count for students with disability who have exited post-secondary education. So again, that's the status and the non-participation reason. The count of students with disabilities who served and exited special education by exit reason and age. The count of and these counts are needed by IDEA, but they're also on your state performance plans, right? They're SPPI, state performance plan indicators, right? And so if you're a SIS data coordinator and you're unfamiliar with the state performance plan indicator, it's almost like a special education LCAP or dashboard, right? You have a state performance plan, which provides information to their annual report that they have to submit to the feds. And so our dashboard indicators ultimately is used to inform ESSA or the requirements for the Every Student Succeeds Act. For special education, our state performance plan indicators ultimately are used to meet the data requirements by the Individuals with Disability Act. So that's what a lot of these counts are used for if you're unfamiliar with them. This shows you the granularity of data needed. When we say they need the information on exits, this is how the data is presented to the feds, right? The count and percent of students with disabilities who have exited special education by race and ethnicity. That's going to be a reoccurring theme. Same with percentage, the count of percent of female and male students, right? So they're looking at genders that have exited and the count of English learners and non-English learners who have exited special education. All of this is on the SPPI, right? So let's look at that. And I think the best way to do that again is to look directly at the disability status. We'll open it up and we have the status code. So you see eligible and participating. And then these three, all right, 2, 3, and 4 show up on the end of year 4 reports when you think about exits, right? Students who have exited special education. So those are students who are eligible and not participating, students who are eligible and not enrolled, right? And so that's why some of your end of year 3 data is so important because some special education exits may be because students are no longer enrolled. And then those students who are just simply not eligible or who are not found eligible. So the status in conjunction with the non-participation reasons. Some of these non-participation reasons, we used to have special education exit codes. Some of them, like withdrawal, maximum age, directly align with previous special education exit reason codes, but some of these are or have been added because they're more descriptive non-participation reasons, right? And so all of these, and in conjunction with the statuses 2, 3, and 4, are what are reported as special education exits. And then we have special education meeting file, and the meet records are used primarily for child find, right? Because they provide counts for students who parental consent was given and the student was evaluated, and it also is how we identify students whose evaluations were or were not completed within 60 days, right? And so here's the meeting file. And so you can see that the initial parental consent date is here. And that's how we can identify if the student had a timely evaluation. Once consent is given, then you have your meeting type code, whether it was initial meeting or a reevaluation, right? So when we were talking earlier that the plan record has to have a corresponding meeting type code, right? A student on a IEP or ISP has to have a Part B meeting. They can't just have a Part C. Part C is for our IFSP, right? They have to have a Part B meeting somewhere in there showing that the student transitioned from IFSP to IEP. And so these are some of the more important fields in the meeting as it pertains to end of year 4. And then we'll move on to the plan. So meet record key fields. I guess the evaluation outcome code will tell you if the student is eligible for services or not. That's important for child find. Again, we're not just looking at those students with active plans in end of year 4. Any student that was evaluated will show up on the report. And then your special education plan records. A lot of the data comes from the plan. because it's about the, students who have active plans, right? So when you have your meetings and we outline the services the student's going to have, those are all going to be in the plan. We talk about their learning environments, that's all going to be outlined in the plan. So the plan also provides us because the account of who's on a Part C or Part B. So that's IFSP or IEP or ISP, right? IEP and ISPs are Part Bs. The count of students on the IFSP who were referred but not eligible for IEP. So those students who are transitioning, being an infant, receiving services to preschool and they were denied. Count of those students who were declined because their parents didn't provide consent. A count of students ages 16 and above on IEPs that are missing components required of post-secondary transition. Again, these counts are for the state performance plan indicators. And so a lot of times we talk about the counts as required by IDA. We don't go into detail, but this is what has to be provided by your LEA. And then here's your special education plan record. And so a lot of the key fields in terms of end of year 4 be those indicators that are related to transition. We'll point out the general education participation percentage because during the course of the year, students who meet the criteria of both being 4 years old or 5 years old and in kindergarten are considered school age. And so this has to be reported, right? You have to tell us what percentage of time their general education participation percentage is there. Students may begin school at 4 years old, right? Although they may not change grade level, their age changes, and all of a sudden you have to report this. Um, Same with students who turn 16. You have a lot of these indicators, post-secondary goal indicators, transition services indicators. All of a sudden you have to start reporting these indicators because the student's age has changed during the course of the year. And so you see that a lot in end of year 4 because several months have gone by since fall 1, right? There's a lot of opportunity. Majority of students probably have birthdays sometime during the academic year. In general, the important fields or the ones that provide the data that we use most would be the plan type, right? Special education plan type code, whether the student is on IFSP or ISP, right? In particular, pending for end of year 4, not significant for fall 1. And then these are the plan types when the student is not found eligible, right? The special education program setting code is important. It speaks to the student's learning environment, and in particular, in combination with the education percentage, the least restrictive environment. When a student, same with the general education participation percentage, when a student meets the condition of being 5 and being in kindergarten, there are certain environments not appropriate for the student, and often an amendment record needs to be submitted. I would expect you to encounter some of that in end of year 4. Those are a couple things that we want to point out here. And that was this slide. And then when we speak on special education services, we don't certify services. They're not on a certification report. However, the services are reported and used for monitoring. And so with the services, here's your service file. I guess the student doesn't have service, but we can point to the headings, right? The education service code would provide the description of the service being provided. A student could have multiple services. The special education provider code will identify who's providing the service. And then you have a location code. So a student could receive services several places. When you think about your infants, uh, their service could be provided at home. I point out infants because a lot of times we have trouble finding the proper way to enroll infants. And then your service code frequency and duration, they tell us how often and for how long those services are provided. And so that was the service record. And so now we have the post-secondary status. And I think this is Kyron's our PSTS expert. This is where he may jump in here.
Okay, Nate. All right. Okay, so Nate mentioned the first four files that are expected for special education students in the end of year four collection. However, there is also the fifth file, which is the post-secondary status, and this is required or expected for LEAs with so for post-secondary status files, this file or records are expected for school districts who have high schools. If you have a district that's just elementary or K to 8, then this does not pertain to you. So the end of year post-secondary status records provide data for the state performance plan indicator for post-school outcomes. We submitting this would help monitor outcomes of students with disabilities 1 year after leaving high school and never re-enrolling in any California school again. That's a key element there. Okay. It helps us examine whether these students are enrolled in higher education, have any competitive employment, or are in some other form of education or training. Okay. So when you submit the files, we aggregate the counts of students based on the survey results and outcomes that are submitted to CALPADS. So this file has been collection has been ongoing for a while, and so it is expected that your special education system would already have dialed in all of the business rules to be able to generate the list of students who are expected to be surveyed for the end of year PSTS collection. If not, then this next PowerPoint would be a presentation slide would at least provide you the list of students who would qualify for a survey. So anyone who exited secondary education, any special education student who exited secondary education in 23-24, who were exited as a completer, or with these exits and never re-enrolled in any of the California schools would be eligible to be surveyed. So there is a page in the user manual for the PSTS collection. Encourage you to go there. There is also the link to the PSTS survey template guide and the SPED survey template. So once you've determined the list of students, you can then go ahead and create a template that you would attach to a communication you would send to those students. If your students then answer those questions and send back results, you then import that in your special education system and then extract together with your other files come end of year four. So the key element for the PSTS, at least for end of year four, would be having the education program participation code, which should be a 30, and then the post-secondary status of the student. You also would need the local special education student ID, which obviously would be stored in your SEDS system. Okay, so this is the same if you were submitting PSTS records during Fall 2. You should be aware of the process for PSTS for end of year four. It's the same, sort of, but the source of those records will come from your SPED system. And there are resources. Let me just share with you some resources here. We have Flash 203. Let me just copy that here and post it in the chat box. You have the CalPads user manual. Just type PSTS. Just go to the end of your roadmap. There should be your end of year four submission. You have your PSTS link here of the files needed to be submitted, and you have the section for end of year four in here. All right. So let's just copy that and paste it here. And you should also have the template links over here which brings us to the CTE completers template, which they have a template in here. Actually, that's for the CTE. You also have the questions, the PSTS field where those answers would be inputted, and then the possible choices. All right. So this is a resource you can refer to should you not have those business rules embedded into your special education system. Also, there is those exit rules that I mentioned, as well as how to look for those students in CALPADS. There is the reports in there that you will need to look at. You could probably run report 8.1, ODS 8.1, and generate all of the exits from last year to give you at least a ballpark figure or a raw list of students you may need to survey if you are unable to generate that from your SEDS or SIS system, right? Do we have any questions before we move on to the next topic?
There was one question was about services, Kyron,
Yeah.
and why the service duration is not required for every field. And
Okay.
that's because some services are not provided by a person, right? There's audiological services and special ed vision services, as well as assistive technology services. When you read the definition, they refer to devices given. Sterling, my son is deaf and he's a good
Yeah.
student.
Mhm.
And in any of the assistance that he was given was always through technology. And so there's sometimes it doesn't require a teacher or a person or a specialist. So there is no time duration for those type of services. So it's not strictly required for every service. So that's why. Now, I'm not going to argue with you, right? I understand the point. It could be conditionally required for certain service codes, but if that's what you think would be in best, you should submit a ticket and suggest that. But that's the reason why it's not strictly required for every service.
Okay, there is a question. Should alternative diploma pathway students be included for PSTS? Yes, I think, yeah, you are correct. Wait, did we miss that here? Yeah, we missed it. It's not here. So yes, they will be included. We will update the slides.
But it's conditional
Yeah.
because
Okay.
a student can graduate on, I believe, on the alternative pathway and elect to receive transition services after.
Yeah.
Although they are considered graduates, and if that terminates their K through 12 or TK through 12 education, they then would
Yeah.
be eligible for survey. But I think that one's kind of conditional,
Yeah. And just like the 120 here as well, because sometimes they come back for transition services.
right?
That's a good point. All right. Moving on. So the next sections would be focused more on the work of the CalPADS person, the SIS person, in terms of building the foundation for the data for SPED students and being able to lay the groundwork for the SPED data to come in as well. So, I mean, there's always this back and forth between the SIS coordinator and the SEDS coordinator with regards to uh, the data collection. But bottom line is we're a team and each should know the functions and the responsibilities and the subject matter that one should be an expert in, right? And one should be responsible in. Aside from Marcy, who said she's both the SIS and SEDS coordinator, there should be a focus on what really has to be done and expected for SIS coordinators to be able to better prepare SPED folks in submitting their data to CalPADS. So for SIS coordinators, you won't always have all the answers and you won't be able to do stuff on your own, but at least prepare the groundwork for your special ed coordinators. So why is it important for SIS coordinators to be involved laying out the groundwork for SPED data? As you can see in this table, All of these are expected or collected information related to SPED, and look at all of the file types involved. Majority of them are basically coming from from the student information system. You have your SCNR, SINF, which is for the student profile, which you establish at the start of the year if a student starts the year. And then you have any programs, you have the SELA status, the SYNC, the SEERS, and the SOF if the students are involved in any incident. So there is a heavy load on your part to be able to make sure that all of the data relate that is coming from the SIS is accurate, and that way any SPED data being introduced won't run into any conflict, right? So so again, which LEA is responsible for reporting SWD data? In general, the LEA that provides the majority of special education instruction and related services is responsible for submitting all data to CALPADS, including the SPED data. So what does that mean? So you assume ownership of the enrollment. That way, your SPED person can insert or introduce the special education data. Otherwise, you'll have a GER 5s, and you'll have all of these other validations that would trigger should you have the wrong information in there or no information with regards to enrollment, right? Um, Even for students with disabilities being served by an LA other than the DSEA, the data in CALPA should always be submitted by the LA that provides the majority of special education and related services. And then for students not subject to compulsory education law and not attending school, then the reporting LA generally provides special education services. So these are your 50s. Um, Even though those students who are in private school who are receiving services. So there is a we've always been showing you this, but this here are the different scenarios and enrollment scenarios and ownership scenarios that provide guidance on who should acquire ownership of a record of a student being reported in CalPads, right? So you probably have this already, but just in case you're new, you have that. It provides you all of the scenarios, who should, who, what LA is receiving the service, who is responsible to report it, and what type of enrollment status. Okay, this is key as well. So once you've learned that you need to report ownership of the student, then based on the special education scenario, and age of the student, you will also need to establish the proper enrollment type, right? Which leads me to the next slide, I believe, which is the student enrollment. So what are the relevant student enrollment fields to SPED submission? Number one, the reporting LEA. Of course, if you are the reporting LEA, if you are the one providing services, you have to submit or report your CDS code in the enrollment. Number two is the student take receiving IEP. If yes, then it should be an enrollment status 10. If the student is receiving services but are not generating attendance due to IFSP because they are young, or ISP, then it should be a 50 enrollment. Now, is the student enrolled at any of your regular local school sites? If so, then report the applicable 70-digit CDS code. It could even be your district code, right? If the student is at your district level. Now, if the student is in an NPS school, then obviously report the NPS school code. And if they are in private school, you have to report the private school codes. So these enrollments, come hand in hand with whatever enrollment status you report here. So there is a combo for that. If you have a private school, then it goes to say that your enrollment should be a 50, right? Or if it's an IP, then the enrollment should either be at an NPS or the district code or at a local school district, right? There are times though when you have a school of attendance NPS that is certified in CALPADS, then you will need to include that CDS code. How are you able to locate those codes? You just type here NPS, NPA, CDE, and it brings up the most recent updated spreadsheet of certified LEAs. I guess that's not the one. I thought there was one here. This one here. So let me just copy this, put it here. Because sometimes your NPS schools recertify in the middle of the academic year or NPA schools. So you have to download this NPS school and agency certified data worksheet to update your SIS system with the correct NPS codes. All right, so what is the best practices for obtaining data needed for SSID creation? So, there is always this conflict between CIS coordinators or SPED, and SPED would say, hey, could you obtain an SSID for the student, right? But then the CIS coordinator would say, oh, we don't have all of the required information, so we'll have to wait. But in terms of just gathering or generating SSID, there are just minimal information that an SIS coordinator would be able to collect, to gather, and generate an SSID. So for the next slide would present that. For now, infants and preschool students are required to complete the packet for TK to 12 students, right? And so make sure that all of those minimum requirements that would be laid out on the next slide, or I believe the next two slides from here, would be able to at least meet the requirements to generate an SSID. Okay. Then sometimes some LAs have indicated that getting all the data required for a student profile is difficult, as I've mentioned. And so you may have to do your best to be able to gather that information. Okay. So let's just go here. So completing the demographic profile. No, in fall one, we always establish a student profile, and that information is your building block for the next file type submission. So you have your student enrollment, you have your student information, which includes all of the demographic information, the birth date, the gender, race and ethnicity, parent guardian level ed code. So all of those are included in the student profile. So at the minimum, for a SPED student, you at least have to have the SENR and SINF established within your system and import that to be able to generate an SSID, right? So here are the minimum data requirements. So you have your reporting LEA, you have the school of attendance, and then of course the NPS if applicable, the academic year, your local student ID, which your system can, auto-generate the student's legal first name, last name, birthday, gender, enrollment start date, status code, and grade level code. So these are the minimum requirements. These three fields here are boxed because of the conditions that, the scenarios with regards to SPED enrollment. So school of attendance could be a 002 because it's an IFSP or IS. If the student is in a private school, right? It could also be a 001. It could be the district code or a regular school within your district where the student enrolls because of general education as well as special education services. Now, with regards to the enrollment start date and status code, this is also, you also have to be aware that depending on the meeting date or whatever information that the SPED introduces, you will also have to adjust the enrollment start dates and the enrollment status codes. Okay? So, but here is your minimum requirements. Okay. So for student with enrollments, these are the scenarios, and this is in the CalPADS FAQ that Nate introduced earlier. So you have here students who are infants. They are expected to be a 50 enrollment and reported at the district level, right? And then the start date would be the date of parental consent for parsing initial evaluation. You also have students who are preschool. In before, preschoolers were automatically 10, right, regardless of what scenario they were in. However, there are exceptions, and this is one of them, and it was implemented, I think, 2 years ago or a year ago. So if you have a student 3 to 5 years old who are private schools and additionally serving grades TK above, and the students serve on an ISP, you report a 50 enrollment, and then the enrollment start date would be their third birthday or the state of parental consent for evaluation, and then you have your preschool, and then report them as a 002. Okay, take note that a 50 go hand in hand with a 002 enrollment. Okay, so that's one of those key elements. If you later on get a data discrepancy because of this conflict, that's probably why you have a 002 or 50, or you have a 50 and a 10, right? So, and then you also have your preschoolers. So that are in regular IEP, 3 to 5 years old, and you may report them at the district level or at a preschool specific CDS code if you have a preschool site at your district. So bottom line here is that you have to know, based on the age, based on the special education plan, what type of enrollment you should establish, and the enrollment start date that you will include on the student enrollment record.
And
Because
if I
once,
could,
yes, go ahead, Nate.
I want to say, if I could jump in, this isn't a suggestive table, right? This table's meant to tell you how to do it. A lot of times, like if you go to the top row, the infants, it says district level enrollment. We're not saying they have a district level enrollment. We're telling you to create a district level enrollment. The infants are being served at home, but they have to be reported to CalPADS, and that's what new data coordinators miss. When we go to conferences, we learn there's always a disconnect because in terms of enrollment, you all don't have an enrollment, right? They don't attend any schools in the district, but they're receiving services. And so you have to create that district level enrollment. Some student information systems allow you to create a virtual school to house all these kids. And when it comes to CalPADS, it's using your district code. But this is the guidance telling you how to do it. Any student receiving services that's in your SEDS data system, your special education data system, has to be in your SIS so that it can get to CalPADS. And so that's the one thing I want to emphasize is this table is telling you how to do it and how it should be done. Also, Kyron pointed out the enrollment status 50 and private school. You don't have liberty to use an enrollment status 50 for any scenario you want. Non-ADA is just a name. We're not creative, right? We're not artistic people. We're data people. We know that non-ADA refers to a lot of different enrollment scenarios, but in terms of CalPADS, you can only use it for private school students or infants, students with disability. And so I just wanted to add that this table is for guidance. It's not saying if this is your scenario, we're trying to tell you how to report these students. Sorry about that, Kyron. I was getting excited.
That's great, Nate. And just to point out, none of us except Marshall is creative.
I disagree with that. For sure.
Okay. All right. Okay, so how to maintain enrollments for newly evaluated students. So if, let's say, you've already generated the SSID and the student is now being assessed, right? If after initial evaluation the student was determined to be eligible in participating, then the enrollment should be maintained for the duration of the academic year and then exited at the end of the year. Okay? If the student was determined ineligible or the parent declines, then the student will not participate in special education services for other reasons. Okay, and then if the enrollment and then the enrollment can be exited with a no-show N470, and the exit date should equal to the enrollment start date. So this here, there is an error later on that I would show you guys, that would basically tell us, it could be based on the scenario. So if the student declines, or if at some point the student was participating and then next year or at the end of the year the student was determined to no longer be eligible or just decide to not participate, then of course the meeting and the SWD status must be updated. Otherwise, there would also be a conflict, because expectations is that if a student has an existing eligible and participating status, then the next LEA who would inherit the student are expected to report special education status or a special education plan and meeting, right? There is a CDD error that I will demo later on that would explain this. All right, so here are some scenarios of how to exit enrollment for students with disabilities. So again, as Nate mentioned, this is not a suggested resolution. This is the the actual codes that you need to use to be able to, you know, to finalize an exit for a student with disability, right? So if a student is eligible in participating, obviously each at the end of each year, the student needs to be exited because of the end of year three requirement. And so you need to exit an infant with an E170. Any enrollment type that says 50 should be an E170. Okay? 50 enrollment should be an E170, except for, of course, if you have a non-ADA and the student is no longer eligible, then you have an N470. You only use the N470 if, based on the assessment, the student is not eligible. Okay. Now, if the student is eligible and not participating, then of course, and the student is is obviously part of the regular education, keep the enrollment going because the student is there, right? However, if the student is eligible but decide not to participate based on these things, then you have to exit the student as well using the same enrollment start date. Okay. All right. So we have here our adult age SWD in transition program. So I believe if you were in the Wednesday Q&A, Brandy had a lengthy you know sermon on how to use this, how is this applicable. So if you only report an adult age SWD in transition program if the student no longer on coming back and receiving services. Okay, so if they are a 12th grader, and the next year the student comes back and wants and just to receive services, then, of course, you will need to make sure that the adult age SWD in transition program indicator is marked as a yes if you are providing services. Now, if no, then of course that should be a no, right? So here are the requirements or expectations when CalPAS would require you to mark the indicator. So if a student is 17 and above, and in grade 12, obviously it could be the second grade 12, and the special education status is eligible in participating, and the plan type is 100, then this error would kick in. Normally, this error kicks in at the end of the year because sometimes the student is 16 and then later on the student turns 17 mid-year, right? And so at the end of the year, you would wonder how come this wasn't triggering when I uploaded this enrollment record at the start of the year. That's because the student turned 17. So if the student is 17, 12, and a SPED student with an IEP, and you're basically you can mark it as a yes or a no. Either way, you have to report or flag the indicator. That's what this means. Okay. All right. So as I've mentioned, there are what do you guys need to do? You always have to be proactive, right? So there are common errors that would help you flag um, any students that need to be reassessed or need to be met, or you have incoming students that you just enrolled at the end of the year and you get an SENR 0606E4. Okay, and so you have to then tell your SPED person, hey guys, this we just got this student, and this appears to be a SPED student. Could you then go ahead and meet with the student, or at least provide a plan record which you could probably adopt and make sure that the student is meet and plan record to fulfill the requirements for the end of year program for these students. So you also have to have make sure that all missing transition indicators are fulfilled. Then of course, if you have your students who turn 17, this has to be updated. Then, of course, you always have to look at your monitoring report 1621 to monitor any students who may be late with regards to meetings and assessments. And then, of course, you have to account for students who completed high school as a graduate through the alternate pathways or based on the actual certificate of completion. So you have to do this. That way you would be able to, prepare the establish any exits, proper exits for the students this year. That way next year the student won't be expected to be reported in CalPADS, right? So these are some of the proactive steps, and some of these errors we will demo during the second half of this session. So with that, do we have any questions or
We have,
anything that has to be highlighted?
yeah, we have a few questions in the chat box, Kyron. I was
Yes.
a little bit distracted, so we'll start answering them in the break, and we can answer them when we come back. I took the share from you, Kyron.
Yes,
Um,
I see that.
in the chat, I posted a link earlier, and so when we're developing the training and we're trying to have content that's relevant, we're trying to find, where the data that we collect into year four goes. And a lot of it again goes to the SPP or State Performance Plan Indicators, SPPI, and that's used to develop the annual performance report. The annual performance report goes to the feds, and you can actually on the Department of Education, the federal website, see what California did. The indicators that come from end of year, of course, are end of year four, right? Our indicator four, suspension and expulsion rates, and then 11 through 14, right? Child fine, so those counts of students with disabilities who have been evaluated and tested, the transition indicators, particularly early childhood transition, secondary transition, and of course, post school outcomes. So these four are derived from end of year four data, and then end of year three, of course, contributes. But I point to this because if you watch a video, they're short, they're concise, they're kind of fun, right? They did a good job on these videos. Uh, I, th- I I think someone outside of the CD produced them, so that's good, even though they are CD videos. And then these handouts describe the data and how it's used. And there's one for every indicator. So if you're unfamiliar with this page, the link is in the chat. It really tells you, about the state performance plan indicators, but also it helps you, identify what data being submitted is going. Rosario asked, why are we allowed to enforce 70 with the day before the start date? That's not advisable for special education. Historically in CALPADS, when you use the no-show code, you can use the same day as the enrollment or you can use the day before. That's because N4 70 was implemented way before special education and it excluded people from reports, right? There was either pre-enrollment, students came and left, and we needed a way to exclude them from reports. And if a student only had a single line of enrollment, like a kindergartner, you couldn't delete it. And so you would have to use the N470 to exclude them. It causes a problem in special education because we use N470 in reports. Those infants, those young students that have their initial evaluation and are found not eligible, they still have to be included on reports for child fine, right? This student was tested. That's basically what we're saying. We're completing our obligation for finding kids. And so they found that predate that when you exit a student in 470 with the date before their enrollment was still excluding students from the report. Basically, that logic doesn't make sense. CALPADS is not including them on reports. So for special education students, you should use the same day as the student start date for N470. I don't know if that's what you were asking, Rosario, but that's the reasoning behind if you've received any guidance, and that's came directly from Brandy, how the N470 was going. And then Eva, how do we deal with attendance reporting for end of year of students who fall in enrollment status 10 because they are in grades TK through 12 but are only receiving services? So the students that are only receiving services, I have questions. If they are TK and not going to TK because it's not, statutory obligation, right? They don't have to go to TK or KN. I would say you report them at the district, right? Whether they're preschool or whatever the appropriate grade level is for them receiving their special education services. If they are grades 1 through 12 and only receiving services, I'm questioning, are they enrolled somewhere else? Right? And then you have to really be talking to your special education data coordinator because a lot of times you might be receiving the service but not be the reporting LEA. Even though you're providing the service, sometimes the service provider isn't always the reporting LEA. And if you know a student is only receiving service that school age, I would wonder, are they receiving the rest of their curriculum somewhere else? Is their home district reporting them? I don't want to give you a blanket answer, but there is no limitation. Any age student, any grade level can be reported at the district when they are not actually in attendance, right? The district enrollment is used for a lot of different scenarios. So those are the two that I had time to review and think of an answer for, Kyron.
All
I
right.
could,
And I did answer the STAS question. If this does not meet your the explanation you needed, let me know.
You have completed this module. Please continue to the next video. Thank you.